May 14th, 1940, 5:12 hours, south of Arras, northern France. The bombardment had started only seconds before, but the earth already felt as if it had been trembling for hours. Damp soil leapt into the morning air with every impact, clods thudding against helmets, steel hulls, and the sides of abandoned farm buildings that still smelled of last night's smoke. The dawn fog, so thin when the first British sentries blinked awake, had thickened strangely, rolling in long ghost-like sheets across the fields as if pulled there by the concussion of German artillery. For Lance Corporal Michael Avery, crouched beside the hulking form of a Matilda II, the fog became the only shield he trusted. Not the 2 inches of armor above him, not the machine gun strapped at his side, not even the full might of the British Expeditionary Force. No, just the fog, thin, pale, trembling in the air with every shell blast. But it was enough to hide movement, or at least to pretend it did. A new explosion hit closer than the rest, a bright gout of soil spraying sideways like a broken wave. Avery ducked instinctively, but the blast never reached him. It diffused simply, absorbed by the silent, immovable giant beside him. The Matilda's angular turret and thick steel plates drank the shock like an anchor. The tank didn't even shudder. "Blimey," Avery whispered to himself, breath fogging in the cold air. "You're a stubborn beast, aren't you?" Inside the turret, Captain Harold Pritchard adjusted his goggles and shouted down to his driver. "Engine running?" Corporal Duncan Shaw answered with a flat, bored tone that only tank crews seemed capable of maintaining under fire. "She's purring, sir." "Well, she's doing whatever Matildas do." A sort of metallic growl mixed with an asthmatic cough. Pritchard smirked despite himself. "That'll do." Above them, the sky shifted color. First a pale blue, then a soft, bruised gray. Smoke, fog, dawn, artillery dust. The layers blended until the horizon dissolved entirely. It was impossible to tell where the fields ended and the world began. What the British tank crews didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that only a few kilometers ahead, General Major Erwin Rommel was already preparing his men for what he expected to be another effortless push. Another day of blitzkrieg momentum, another domino in France ready to fall. Rommel had spent the early morning pacing a narrow ridge, binoculars in hand, his officers behind him murmuring confidently. The 7th Panzer Division had torn through everything in its path. "The British are slow," one lieutenant said. "Too slow. Their armor is a joke." "Obsolete," another officer chimed in. "Clunky, undergunned. They could barely threaten our light reconnaissance units." Rommel listened without comment, though a hint of a grin touched his lips. He didn't disagree. Not yet. He certainly didn't expect what was coming. Back at the British lines, the atmosphere shifted subtly, an unspoken tension passing between the men as runners, officers, and radio operators moved with increasing speed. Orders had begun to crystallize. The counterattack long whispered about in mess tents, debated in briefing rooms, and doubted by half the officers was suddenly, impossibly becoming real. 58 tanks, every Matilda one, and 2 they could scrape together. A handful of infantry carriers, supporting units moving by truck. And ahead of them, the German spearhead. Avery watched Pritchard climb back onto the tank's hull, boots slipping slightly on the dew-darkened steel. "Orders coming down, sir?" he asked. Pritchard nodded, though his face remained unreadable. "We move at 6. The whole column. Straight into them." Avery exhaled. "Into them, sir?" "Into them," Pritchard confirmed. "No flanking, no retreat. Just a straight punch." The fog thickened again, as if reacting to the words. A cold wind swept across the empty fields, and for a moment there was nothing, no shell fire, no shouted orders, no grinding engines, only the distant creak of a farmhouse door blown loose by the earlier blasts. Then a single sound broke the stillness, the rising growl of tank engines. Not German. British. Matilda after Matilda. Their silhouettes emerging from the mist like dark, armored phantoms, stubby, square-faced, low-slung forms with riveted helmets of steel. The Matilda, too, was no beauty. It was a fortress masquerading as a vehicle, standing nearly shoulder-height to a grown man, and moving with the slow, stubborn determination of a bull that refused to charge until it absolutely had to. The men looked around, realizing, some with disbelief, others with grim acceptance, that they were part of something far larger than a local counterprobe. This wasn't a minor push. This wasn't a token gesture. This was a strike intended to hurt the Germans. And whether it would succeed, no one dared say. Pritchard dropped back inside the turret. Right then, eyes open, guns ready. Keep your ears sharp. We'll be blind as moles once we move through this fog. Shaw placed both hands on the controls, fingers trembling despite his effort to hide it. Aye, sir. The interior of the Matilda glowed dimly with the faint orange of instrument lights. Oil fumes mingled with metal dust, and the residual tang of cordite from yesterday's minor skirmishes. Every surface vibrated lightly with the idling engine, like the tank was breathing. Outside, Avery ran to join his infantry section just as the tanks began their slow, rolling advance. The ground quivered as 58 armored vehicles pushed forward, tracks digging into soft earth, clumps of mud flinging out behind them. "Look at that," Private Harris murmured beside him. "Like iron giants rising out of the sea." Avery said nothing. He was watching the fog ripple, compress, and swirl around the lead Matilda. Its heavy gun pointed forward like a spearhead. What unnerved him wasn't its power, but the silence from the German lines. No machine gun bursts, no mortars firing, no advancing engines. Nothing. The blitzkrieg had been thunderous for days. And now, quiet. Too quiet. The tanks crept toward a shallow depression in the field, the kind that could hide a company of infantry or worse, an anti-tank gun line. The Matildas continued anyway, obedient to orders, unstoppable in their mechanical certainty. Avery felt something tighten in his stomach. Fog, silence, a perfect killing ground. Pritchard saw it too. Through the narrow slits of the turret, through shifting curtains of mist, he sensed a presence ahead. Movement he couldn't see, shapes he couldn't define. He leaned toward the periscope, and then, for the briefest moment, he saw a flash, metal catching dawnlight. A long barrel, low silhouette, German. He jerked back. "Driver, stop the—" But it was already too late. A thunderous crack erupted ahead, echoing across the field like the opening note of a terrible symphony. The first German anti-tank round was already in flight. The German shot sliced through the fog like a streak of molten metal, trailing a thin whisper of air displacement behind it. It wasn't loud, not at first, just a sharp, cutting hiss, the kind a razor might make if swung through the air at impossible speed. But when it struck, the world erupted. The round slammed into the glassy plate of the lead Matilda II with a sound like a church bell breaking. A deep, ringing concussion rolled across the fields, bouncing off farmhouse ruins and the shattered trunks of poplar trees. Sparks exploded from the impact point, scattering across the tank's steel hide like droplets of burning rain. For 3 full seconds, nothing seemed to happen. Inside the tank, Pritchard braced instinctively against the shock. His hearing throbbed, ear canals filled with metallic static. Shaw froze mid-motion, one hand hovering above the gear lever, the other gripping the tiller bar like a lifeline. The interior lights flickered, steadied, then held. The tank hadn't penetrated. Not even close. Pritchard blinked twice, almost disbelieving. Direct hit, and we're still breathing. Shaw let out a shaky laugh. "Armor's holding, sir. Bless her iron soul." But outside, the infantry had no time to marvel. Avery and his section dropped to the ground instinctively, helmets ringing from the shockwave. Dirt slapped their faces. Pebbles bounced off their packs. Someone cursed as the breeze carried the echo of a second German gunshot firing in the distance. "Positions!" Sergeant Fielding barked. "Find cover and watch for muzzle flash." They scrambled behind a torn hedgerow, little more than tangled branches and mud. But it was enough to give them a view without exposing themselves fully. Avery pressed his cheek against the cold earth and searched the fog-smeared horizon. There, a shadow moving, then another, then the faint silhouette of a figure crouching behind a gun shield. "Anti-tank guns at 11 o'clock, Avery shouted, voice cracking through the chaos. "Looks like Pack 30 SXS. Harris swore under his breath. "Those pea-shooters? Against Matildas? Pea-shooters or not," Avery muttered. "They're aiming right at us." A third German round screamed through the air and smashed into the same Matilda II that had taken the first hit. This time the crew inside felt the tank rock back an inch. Not pierced, not damaged, but definitely angered. Its thick armor shrugged off the attack with the indifference of a sleeping giant unwilling to wake. Pritchard slammed his fist against the turret rim. "We're not here to sit in fog and take potshots. Traverse right. Load AP." The loader, Corporal Ian Colton, obeyed without hesitation. He shoved a solid armor-piercing round into the breach with practiced speed. "Loaded. Driver, forward. 3 yards." Shaw eased the Matilda forward, the tank growling as it pushed through wet grass and churned mud. Every movement made the fog swirl like disturbed spirits. Pritchard peered through the periscope. The German gun crew was visible now. For silhouettes scrambling to reload, their movements sharp and frantic. They had expected an easy kill. Something quick. Something decisive. They were wrong. "On target," Pritchard whispered, finding the aim. "Fire!" Colton struck the trigger. The Matilda's 2-pounder roared, belching a jet of flame and smoke that cracked through the morning air like thunder. The recoil jostled the turret. The round tore into the fog, then emerged on the other side, right into the Pack 30 SXS shield. The German gun shattered like clay, exploding into shards that cartwheeled through the air. 2 of the crew disappeared in the blast. The others scattered in blind panic. The British infantry saw it and rose as one, letting loose rifle fire to keep the survivors from regrouping. Avery felt the pulse of adrenaline rush through him. That's it. Keep them on the run. But the fog hid more threats. Much more. Further up the slope, Lieutenant Otto Schreiber of the Wehrmacht's 14th Panzerjäger Company watched the destruction of his first gun with stunned disbelief. His men murmured nervously behind him. "That tank," one whispered. The round bounced. It bounced. Schreiber swallowed hard. "Reload the next battery. Aim lower. Fire together on my command." "But sir—" "Do it," he snapped. The Germans were realizing something terrible. They had underestimated the enemy. Word had spread through the division that British armor was slow, thin-skinned, vulnerable. But whoever had written those assumptions clearly hadn't faced the Matilda II. This was no flimsy reconnaissance vehicle. This was a bunker on tracks, and 58 of them were advancing. Schreiber watched the fog thicken again, swallowing the British tanks into a shifting wall of white. He felt sweat gather at his collar despite the cold. He reached for his binoculars, but saw nothing but swirling mist. "This fog," he muttered. "Why now?" But it wasn't the fog that terrified him. It was the silence inside it. The silence broken only by the thumping approach of British engines. The Matildas continued forward, each step of track pressing deeper into the mud. Tanks rarely felt alive, but this morning, each one seemed to breathe, exhale, pulse with its own heartbeat. They moved not like machines, but like an advancing herd of armored beasts. Suddenly, a new sound echoed ahead, a heavier one, a mechanical growl deeper than the Pack 30 SIXS. a sound the British infantry recognized instantly. "Sir," Harris whispered, that's not an anti-tank gun." Avery listened, heart pounding. He knew that sound too. Every soldier on the Western Front did. Tracked movement. Multiple vehicles. German armor. Pritchard heard it as well. The turret cramped around him. He leaned closer to the periscope, trying to see through the fog. Shapes moved. Dark. Angular. Advancing. "Driver, halt!" The Matilda lurched to a stop. Pritchard wiped the inside of his goggles. The silhouettes grew clearer. Longer hulls, sleeker frames, turrets shaped differently than anything British. "Bloody hell," Shaw breathed. That's Panzers." But there was something strange. They weren't maneuvering. They weren't flanking. They weren't charging forward. The German tanks were idling in place. Uncertain, almost hesitant. As if they, too, had run into something unexpected. Pritchard frowned, realizing something was wrong. Why aren't they moving? Why are they just? He didn't finish, because at that moment, from inside the fog, someone fired a flare. A bright, crimson streak soared upward, bathing the battlefield in ghostly red light. And in that sudden illumination, Pritchard finally saw it. Not just Panzers. An entire German formation. Guns, infantry, vehicles, a full counterforce. Waiting for them, the crimson flare hung in the air like a suspended drop of blood, its glow painting the fog in violent shades of red. Shadows stretched and twisted across the battlefield, turning every tree stump and shattered wall into something sinister. For a heartbeat, the world felt frozen. Every soldier, British and German alike, trapped inside that eerie red stillness. Then the flare sputtered, flickered, and the world moved again. Pritchard sucked in a breath as the full horror of the scene crystallized before him. The fog no longer hid the truth. Hundreds of yards ahead, arranged with brutal precision along the shallow rise, waited a German blocking force. Panzer III tanks crouched behind low folds of earth, their long-barreled 37mm guns aimed straight down the slope. Machine gun teams had dug in between the armor, their barrels already gleaming with condensation. Behind them, rows of infantry were braced for impact, rifles leveled, bayonets fixed. Farther up the field, Schreiber's remaining anti-tank guns formed a jagged crescent, their operators scrambling into new positions like frantic insects building a nest. Pritchard exhaled slowly. So that's their plan. He didn't finish the thought. He didn't need to. The Germans weren't retreating. They were lying in wait. A trap. Carefully positioned, beautifully coordinated, brutally efficient. If the British tanks continued forward, they would be charging directly into the teeth of a mechanized killing ground. Behind Pritchard's tank, Avery felt the same realization wash over him. Through a gap in the fog, he could now see the glint of multiple Panzer hulls. A fresh wave of cold ran down his spine. "Harris," Avery whispered, "tell me I'm seeing wrong." "You're not," Harris answered, voice thin. "They're dug in. And there's a lot of them." Sergeant Fielding sucked his teeth. "They're not trying to break through us. They're trying to stop us." Avery nodded. "Because they know what we're doing. They know this is a counterattack." Another flare fired, this one white. Then everything erupted. A storm of German fire slammed into the British line, ripping through fog and earth. The first volley struck the Matildas with a rapid series of metallic shrieks. Dozens of 37mm shells hammered the armored giants, sparking bright white flashes as they bounced harmlessly off thick plating. The British infantry ducked behind the ridge as machine gun fire stitched the ground around them. Earth sprayed. Branches snapped. Bullets sparked off tank hulls. Yet the Matilda II tanks merely absorbed it, accepting the barrage with the grim patience of stone fortresses. Shaw gripped the controls with white knuckles. "Sir, that's every gun they've got, and not a one is getting through," Colton shouted back, as another German round deflected off the turret in a shower of sparks. Pritchard's eyes flicked between periscope and targeting sight. He could feel it now. The Germans' growing panic. Anti-tank crews shifted position with frantic energy, trying desperately to find an angle that didn't exist. "They're hitting us with everything," Pritchard muttered. "But they can't stop us." He raised his voice. "Gunner, take the rightmost panzer." Colton swiveled the turret, sighted, and fired. The shot tore into the Panzer III's frontal armor with a horrendous clang. Smoke burst from the vehicle. The German tank rocked backward, tracks slipping. Its hatch flew open as the crew bailed out in a frenzy of fear and confusion. "Confirmed disabled," Colton shouted. Other Matildas followed suit. One by one, their 2-pounder guns cracked like rolling thunder, firing into the German positions with steady, methodical precision. Avery risked a glance over the hedge. "They're pulling back," he whispered. "The panzers, they're reversing." "Of course they are," Sergeant Fielding growled. "Those guns of theirs can't punch through a Matilda. They've realized they're outmatched." But it wasn't victory, not yet. Far from it. Captain Pritchard wiped condensation from the inside of his goggles and leaned closer to the periscope. "Driver forward. Slow pace. Keep formation." Shaw clenched his jaw. "Into that, sir?" Pritchard stared through the fog at the smoldering silhouettes of panzer hulls. "Into that." The Matildas crept forward again, their engines rumbling like distant thunder. Each track press sank deeper into the churned soil, leaving long troughs behind them. The fog swirled around their shapes, giving them the appearance of ghostly juggernauts stalking through a dead world. German machine guns opened fire again, rattling uselessly against armor. A rifle grenade exploded near a Matilda, showering Avery and his section with dirt. They ducked lower, but stayed close to the tanks, using them as rolling shields. A sudden burst of light erupted ahead, a German crew firing a heavier weapon. The shell smashed into a Matilda's side with enough force to shake its hull. But even that didn't pierce. Pritchard felt the impact deep in his bones. "They're desperate now." Colton grinned. "Good. Let them be." But the battlefield was changing, and Pritchard sensed it before the others. The fog, thicker now, heavier, swirling like stirred milk, was making visibility dangerous. Shadows moved unpredictably. For every German they could see, there were 3 more hidden behind folds of earth or lingering mist. Shaw slowed the tank. "Sir, if we keep pushing, we'll lose sight of the infantry. And if we stay here, we lose momentum," Pritchard countered. In the rear line, another Matilda fired, its muzzle flash illuminating a new threat. A set of German vehicles advancing from the left flank. Sleek, fast, low profile, armored cars. Pritchard tensed. "That's recon. They're trying to flank our column." Avery saw them too. "Fielding, left flank, vehicles, 1 section pivot." Fielding ordered. "Rifles ready." The British infantry scrambled into new positions, bracing for an assault from the side. But the armored cars weren't firing at them. They weren't even slowing down. They were racing through the fog at full speed, heading straight toward the rear of the British formation. Straight for the supply trucks and soft-skinned support units. Avery's breath hitched. "Oh God, they're trying to cut us off." Pritchard heard the same realization on his radio headset. A frantic voice from Company HQ crackled through static. "Enemy vehicles on your left. Fast movers. They're heading for the transport line. If they break through, they'll trap the whole brigade." Pritchard didn't hesitate. "Driver, hard left. Now!" Shaw wrenched the controls. The Matilda II groaned as it pivoted, tracks grinding, engine roaring. Other tanks followed suit, turning their massive hulls toward the new threat. But the fog hid everything, and as the Matilda lurched forward, Pritchard squinted through the periscope, only to see, for a single horrifying instant, something the Germans had hidden in the mist. Barbed stakes, metal obstacles, and behind them, a fresh German gun line. Closer than before. Much closer. "Driver, brake!" But the command came 1 second too late. Shaw slammed both brakes, but momentum was a merciless force. The Matilda II lurched forward, its 27 tons skidding through mud that splashed high against its hull. The grinding shriek of steel against churned earth tore through the fog as the tank skidded perilously close to the concealed stakes. The Matilda stopped barely a meter short. A heartbeat later, a German round screamed from the hidden gun line and struck the ground just in front of them, blasting a fountain of wet soil that rained across the tank's turret. Pritchard barely kept his balance. "They've dug in another battery, right under our bloody noses." Colton smacked the side of the turret. "We didn't see a thing. This fog's thicker than sandbags." Shaw cursed under his breath. "Sir, if we'd gone a yard further, we'd be stuck on those stakes." Pritchard didn't answer. He was too busy staring at the silhouettes emerging from the mist. Dark lines forming, shifting, moving with coordinated precision. Not a single gun. Not two, but an entire second German anti-tank screen. Schreiber had planned this, or someone above him had. They had studied the British tendency to attack aggressively when armored. They had predicted the counterstrike. And now, as the fog thickened, the Germans revealed their trap piece by piece. Avery and his section dove to the ground as the first volley hit. The noise was deafening. Multiple German guns firing almost simultaneously. Shells screamed through the fog, tearing past the infantry and slamming into the Matildas. One shot hit Pritchard's tank square on the turret ring. The metallic impact shuddered through the hull like a blow from a Titan's hammer. Sparks flew across the interior. Shaw grunted as the force drove him sideways. "Still holding," Colton yelled, gripping the gun breech for support. No penetration, but Pritchard wasn't celebrating. He knew the truth. If the Germans had dug in a second line, they might have heavier guns waiting. He scanned the ridge. "Gunner, search for Pak 38s. They've got to have them somewhere." "If they do," Shaw muttered, "we're in trouble. Because a Pak 38, with its brutal 50mm armor-piercing shot, could crack a Matilda's hide." Avery saw shadows moving ahead, the silhouettes sharpening as the fog thinned slightly. German crews were reloading with terrifying discipline. The barrels of their guns gleamed faintly through the mist like wet spears aimed downward. "Fielding!" Avery shouted. "Germans are repositioning. They're about to fire again. Stay low." Fielding barked. "And keep close to the tanks. They're our only cover." A second volley shrieked. 2 shells hit another Matilda near the center of the British formation. The tank rocked violently, mud spraying in a wide arc. The crew inside shouted, voices muffled by layers of steel. But when the dust settled, the tank remained intact. Matilda armor still held. Barely. For now. But the Germans weren't relying on guns alone. From the left flank, Avery heard the whine of engines, fast, agile, approaching quickly. The armored cars. They were weaving between folds of earth, darting in and out of pockets of fog, moving like hunting wolves. Machine guns blazed from their turrets, spraying the infantry lines. British soldiers ducked behind tank tracks and small craters as bullets hissed overhead. "Harris," Avery called out. "Rifle grenades! Hit those cars before they get around us." Harris and 2 others scrambled to ready their launchers. The first grenade arced through the air, trailing smoke. It landed short, exploding in a burst of dirt. The second overshot. The third landed directly beside one of the armored cars, engulfing it in flame. The vehicle skidded sideways, smoke pouring from its hatch as the crew bailed out. But another car sped through the gap. Fielding narrowed his eyes. "They're heading for the rear again. Bloody persistent, aren't they?" Pritchard saw it too. If they break through, the supply column is done for. We need to stop them. But the Matilda could not turn quickly. Not in this mud, not with obstacles ahead, and certainly not with a full German gun line staring them down. Shaw glanced over his shoulder. "Sir, if we pivot now, we'll expose our sides to the pack guns." Pritchard clenched his jaw. "Then we don't turn. We break their line instead." Colton blinked. Break their line? Through that. Ahead of them, through the fog, the second German position glared back. Lines of anti-tank guns braced behind makeshift cover. Infantry crouched with grenade satchels, and farther still, the looming shapes of Panzer III turrets adjusting their aim. It was madness. It was suicide. It was the only path forward. "Driver," Pritchard said calmly, full throttle. "Straight ahead." Shaw stared. "Sir, if those are Pack 38s, we won't give them time to fire." "Go." Shaw swallowed hard, then slammed the throttle open. The Matilda roared forward, engine bellowing, tracks tearing furrows into the earth. The sudden burst of speed sent Avery stumbling back, but he recovered quickly, sprinting alongside the tank with the rest of his section in its shadow. German crews shouted warnings. They had never seen a British tank charge like that. Fog peeled away in wide arcs as the Matilda plowed forward, clearing a path through the mist like a ship through rough seas. A German crewman spun his wheel frantically, trying to realign his gun. "Too slow." Colton fired. The 2-pounder shot cut through the fog and smashed into the German position. The pack gun burst apart in a violent eruption, flinging shrapnel across the trench. A German soldier spun backward, disappearing into the dirt cloud. Another Matilda fired, and another. The hillside flashed with streaks of muzzle fire as the British armor advanced, unwavering, unstoppable. Avery felt his lungs burning. They're pulling back. The second line is collapsing. But then, from behind the German ridge, he heard it. A deeper sound. A heavier engine. A grinding clatter of treads thicker than any Panzer III. Fielding froze. "What the hell is that?" Pritchard looked through the periscope, instantly recognizing the silhouette rising behind the ridge. A longer gun. A wider turret. A heavier hull. German reinforcements. No. German elite reinforcements. "Sir," Shaw whispered. "Is that?" Pritchard's voice was a whisper of dread. "Yes, that's Rommel's division." The 7th Panzer's heaviest units were entering the battle. The real fight was about to begin. 14:37 hours. The field south of Dussens had begun to glow with the harsh gold of late afternoon. But the battlefield itself looked drained of all color. Smoke rolled in low sheets across the wheat, mixing with the dust kicked up by shells and retreating boots. What had begun as a confident German advance was now a landscape of stunned faces, broken formations, and officers shouting orders that no longer matched the reality unfolding around them. The Matildas did not roar. They loomed. Their engines growled in a deep, almost metallic hum, the kind that vibrated through bone more than ear. As they pushed forward, the fog they had emerged from earlier had long since burned away, but they carried its aura with them. Soldiers on both sides described the same thing years later. The tanks looked less like machines and more like moving slabs of iron, crawling with unnatural patience, advancing even as fire rained down around them. Captain Bill Jock McInnes, riding in a Matilda II of 7th Royal Tank Regiment, adjusted the periscope and scanned the chaos ahead. In every direction, he saw German infantry scrambling for cover, machine gun crews abandoning their positions, and anti-tank teams firing round after round in a frenzy that bordered on panic. But none of it mattered. The shells pinged, skipped, and ricocheted off the Matilda's thick plating like stones off water. Behind him, the infantry of the Durham Light Infantry pressed forward, using the Matildas as walking shields. Every few seconds, McInnes felt the entire tank lurch slightly. A Bren gunner or rifleman slapping a hand against the armor to signal movement, as if the tank were a living partner rather than an engineered tool. Ahead, a line of German vehicles had been hastily arranged as a blocking point. Trucks repositioned as barricades, half-tracks turned sideways, even motorcycles set ablaze to obscure the road. It was a desperate move, the kind soldiers make when doctrine collapses and instinct takes over. But doctrine mattered little now. Matilda too was built for this very moment. McInnes tapped the turret's interior wall twice. The 2-pounder fired. The first truck erupted into a fireball, sending splinters and metal fragments spiraling upward like a distorted fountain. The blocking line shattered, infantry throwing themselves into ditches or sprinting toward the trees. McInnes allowed himself a small, tight grin. For years, the British Army had heard the same criticism. Their tanks were slow, their doctrine outdated, their imagination lacking. And yet here, on this field, they were the storm. But a storm that moves without warning invites its own danger. A flash of movement on the right ridge caught McInnes's eye. Then another. Not infantry. Something larger. Panzer IIIs, 3 of them, rolling down the slope in a wedge formation. Their turrets were already pivoting toward the Matilda line. Commanders partially exposed, yelling orders to the gunners. This was not the usual scattered resistance. This was a counter-stroke. Gunner, right traverse. McInnes snapped, voice echoing inside the metal shell. The turret groaned as it swung. The lead panzer's main gun fired first, the shell streaking toward the nearest Matilda. It hit with a deafening clang and shower of sparks, leaving a black smear but no penetration. The British tank never even flinched. The return fire was immediate and brutal. A 2-pounder round drilled into the panzer's front plate with surgical accuracy. Smoke burst through its hatches like white blood. But the 2 remaining German tanks did not break. They split left and right flanking, searching for weaknesses, for turret rings, tracks, crew hatches, anything. Keep them off our sides. McInnes barked. Driver forward, ramming speed. The Matilda lunged ahead. It looked slow from afar, but up close, 27 tons of steel accelerating directly at you was something else entirely. One of the Panzer IIIs adjusted too late. The Matilda clipped it on the starboard side, crushing its track and sending it spinning. Before the German crew could recover, British infantry swarmed, grenades primed. To the left, the 3rd Panzer III fired again, this time at near point-blank range. The shell struck the Matilda's mantlet, jarring the entire crew. For a moment, the world inside became a whirl of dust, blinking lamps, and ringing ears. The interior lights flickered and died. McInnes tasted iron. Blood? Metal? He couldn't tell. But the tank was still alive. More importantly, so were they. Sight them, he growled. The gunner steadied his aim. The 2-pounder spat fire. The German tank's turret snapped sideways like a struck bell. Then another round, and another, until the Panzer's hatches flew open and the crew tumbled out, hands high. But the battlefield was shifting again. To the north, a fresh wave of German infantry was pouring in. Not retreating now, but reinforcing, forming disciplined lines behind Rommel's reorganized anti-tank guns. To the east, new 88mm guns were being dragged into position, crews sprinting. And to the west, dust clouds signaled yet another armored element moving to cut off the British advance entirely. The window of shock was closing. This was no longer a rout. It was becoming a trap. McInnes swallowed hard. The Matilda might be nearly invincible from the front. But against the 88s? Nothing was invincible. Infantry signaling, the loader shouted. Outside, Durham light infantry runners were waving frantically, faces pale, pointing toward the distant ridge where the new German guns were unlimbering. The message was clear even without hearing their words. Pull back! Now, before the hammer falls. But pulling back meant abandoning the momentum they had carved through hours of relentless advance. It meant giving the Germans a chance to breathe, to reorganize, to strike first. Inside the tank, the crew waited for McInnes's order. Advance, retreat, hope. A battlefield is never silent. But in that moment, it felt silent, as if the war itself were holding its breath. McInnes exhaled slowly and made his decision. 15:04 hours. A long, low rumble rolled across the fields west of Arras. The kind of sound that didn't come from engines or artillery, but from an entire front line shifting in unison. McInnes felt it before he truly heard it, a vibration that fluttered through the Matilda's floor plating. The Germans weren't scattering anymore. They were aligning. He leaned into the periscope. On the far ridge, framed by the sinking sun, the silhouettes of the dreaded 88mm flak guns locked into position like skeletal giants. Their barrels swung down, descending with unnatural grace, angling toward the Matilda column that had carved so deep into the German advance. He had seen these guns before, in training diagrams, intelligence briefings, whispered warnings. Everyone in the British Armored Corps knew one truth. If anything could kill a Matilda II from the front, it was an 88. Driver, McInnes said quietly, hold for my mark. Outside, the infantry of the Durham Light Infantry ran past the Matildas, some waving frantically, others too winded to shout. Their officer, Lieutenant Harrington, sprinted right up to the tank's flank, slapping his glove against the armor. McInnes, he yelled. The whole German line is resetting. Rommel's throwing everything at you tanks. You've got to pull back before they cut the corridor. Inside, the crew exchanged glances. Even through the hull, they could hear the tension in Harrington's voice. Not panic, something far sharper. Urgency. But before McInnes could respond, a flash tore across the ridge. The first 88 fired. For a heartbeat, there was no sound, only the white streak of its vapor trail. Then the thunder hit, a deep, bone-splitting boom that punched the air itself. The shell slammed into the Matilda, leading the left flank. The explosion was catastrophic. Shrapnel spun through the wheat. The turret was hurled sideways, jammed at a grotesque angle. Smoke roared from inside the hull. The tank sagged, not forward, but to the side, like a wounded animal collapsing onto its haunches. No one spoke inside McInnes's tank. Everyone knew. Their armor had finally met something it could not defy. Driver, McInnes whispered, voice tightening, reverse. Slow and steady. The Matilda lurched backward, treads biting into the churned earth. Dust rose around them, mixing with a black plume drifting from the crippled tank ahead. The crew inside that tank hadn't emerged. Whether trapped or killed instantly, McInnes couldn't dwell on it. Not now, not with the ridge glowing with muzzle flashes. Another 88 fired. And another. The Germans weren't just aiming at tanks now. They were reshaping the battlefield, carving out a kill zone where every British vehicle would be exposed. McInnes gritted his teeth. Gunner, smoke shells. Lay a screen between us and those guns. The gunner hesitated. Sir, smoke won't stop an 88. No, McInnes said. But it'll blind their spotters. Fire. The Matilda's gun coughed 3 times. White plumes erupted across the middle ground, thickening into a drifting barrier. It wasn't protection. It was time. A few seconds. Maybe 10. Behind the Matildas, the Durhams reformed, moving from a forward assault line into a fighting withdrawal. Bren gunners took positions in shell holes. Riflemen formed staggered paths back toward the British-held villages. Harrington barked crisp, brutal orders, his voice steadying the entire flank. The British force wasn't routed. It was bending, like a shield adjusting under impact. But the Germans pressed harder now, emerging from the tree lanes with renewed aggression. Machine gun teams dug in along the eastern fence. Mortars thumped. Panzerjäger units began pushing lightweight 37mm guns forward, as if still hoping, or pretending, they could punch through British armor. It was desperation in motion. The British were withdrawing, and the Germans were refusing to let them go. McInnes watched a Stuart scout car dart across the left flank, only to be bracketed by mortar fire. It slewed sideways into a ditch, smoke erupting from its bonnet. Then, over the radio, a crackling message cut through the chaos. All armored units, fall back to counterattack start line. Prepare for final consolidation. German armor regrouping. Do not, repeat, do not, attempt further advance. It wasn't a suggestion. It was survival. McInnes tapped the hull. Driver, steady. Keep the infantry behind us. Loader, watch for flanking movement. As they pulled back, the Matilda's thick armor once again became a shield, not a spear. Bullets snapped across its hull. Mortar fragments clanged against its plating. German infantry surged from the wheat to close the distance, to get close enough to place charges, to fire from the sides, to break the retreat. But the Durhams held firm. A Bren gun team set up under the Matilda's shadow, firing short, controlled bursts that stitched across the field and stalled German momentum. A mortar crew, sweating and nearly out of rounds, dropped their final shell. A perfect hit that shattered a Panzerjäger team racing forward with a satchel charge. It wasn't victory, but it was defiance. And defiance buys seconds. Seconds by survival. The retreat became a controlled fallback toward Arras. The Matildas never turned their backs fully. Always angled, always ready to fire another round. Every few dozen meters they paused, covering the infantry as they crossed the next dip in the land. When McInnes glanced through the periscope again, he saw something strange. The German advance was slowing. Not stopping, slowing. Why? Then he understood. They feared another armored punch. Even after the 88s, even after bloodying the British line, a shadow of doubt had taken root. The idea that somewhere beyond the smoke, more of those invincible beasts might be waiting. Fear, once planted, grows quickly in war. By the time the Matildas reached the outskirts of Dussens, the battlefield behind them was a darkening tapestry of smoke columns and abandoned equipment. The British line was battered, shaken, but not broken. McInnes finally lifted himself out of the turret hatch, breathing in the evening air. It smelled of dust and burnt cordite, and something else he hadn't expected. Relief. The Durhams passed by, some giving weary thumbs-ups, others too exhausted even to speak. Harrington approached the Matilda, helmet askew, face streaked with grime, and managed a crooked grin. Not bad for a bunch of obsolete tanks, he said. McInnes let out a harsh laugh. I suppose we've ruined someone's day. But far across the fields, beyond the fading smoke, another figure was already planning the next move. General Erwin Rommel, furious, exhilarated, and deeply shaken. He would claim the day as a German success, cite the British withdrawal as proof of dominance. But privately, he'd remember the shock. He'd remember the armor that refused to die. He'd remember the moment the unstoppable advance almost broke. And years later, veterans on both sides would say the same thing. Arras didn't change the war, but it scared the hell out of the Wehrmacht.